Hello, my name is Jeremy Hauk. I'd like to thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. Today, our study of this Christmas story takes us to chapter 2, and we're going to discover it's harvest time. Bethlehem is recovering from a long famine. The barley harvest has just begun, and there's hope once again in the land as people are filling their bellies with grain and with bread. But Naomi and Ruth's bellies are still grumbling. They're back in Bethlehem, but they've not been able to reclaim the land that's a part of their inheritance. They're not able to break up the ground or to plant or to even work the fields. Even if they had their inheritance back, it was not going to be able to provide them what they needed at this moment. There are not going to be any miracles in this story. At least, not the same kind of miracles that we read about in the books of Genesis and Exodus. But what we do see is that God is moving, working through the normal events of life to pour out his mercy and his grace. I said last week that God does most of his work in the background where we can't see him. It's true for Naomi and Ruth, and it's true for you and me. Following God doesn't always feel like a straight line. Sometimes it feels more like we're chasing a rabbit through the wilderness. Ruth and Naomi, they just returned to Bethlehem and they have nothing. Ruth is a young widow. She probably could have stayed in Moab where she would get remarried and have a family and a future for her own. But instead, she chose to commit to the Lord in faith. She followed Naomi to Bethlehem, where it's really unlikely that she's ever going to remarry, that she'll ever have children. The book of Ruth is a love story, and it's not just the story of Ruth, and it's really not the story of Ruth and Boaz. It's the Christmas story in miniature. It's the story of somebody who finds themselves in great peril and in great need, and they know they can't do anything to save themselves, but God is not going to allow them to stay in distress. He provides a redeemer, somebody who comes in and offers mercy and grace. The story of Ruth is a beautiful reminder that God sees us and he's working. Today we get to chapter 2 and we discover that in the life of Ruth and Naomi, there is a real need. Now, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father in law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord blesses you," the harvesters replied. Chapter 1 ends with Naomi changing her name to Bitter. She's poor, husbandless, foodless, and everything elseless. But at least she's a true Israelite. On the other hand, Ruth is a Moabite. Naomi has a lot going against her. Ruth has even more. We discovered last week that God refused to call Naomi bitter. We also learned it's the beginning of the barley harvest. Chapter 2 begins by telling us that there is this wealthy and influential man in the town, a man who possessed large tracts of lands and farms and fields filled with barley that was ready to be harvested. That man just happened to be a relative of these two women who find themselves hungry and destitute. Ruth makes the decision to go into the fields to glean. Maybe it's because she's hungry, or maybe it's out of her concern for Naomi. She's not really sure how or where she's going to get something to eat. All she knows at this moment is we're hungry, we have no food, and there's no husband, father, or son to provide for us. We're all on our own. There's an important aspect of the story that we usually miss. They're back in Israel, and unlike the gods of the Amorites, the Hittites, or even the Moabites, the God of Israel has laws concerning the welfare of the people living in the land. In Leviticus 23, we read, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner." God is very adamant. He tells his people, the land that you own actually still belongs to me. So when you work the land, leave a little bit around the edges so that the poor, the widows, the orphans, the foreigners, the oppressed, the immigrants, the needy, they can come in and work and get something to eat, something to feed themselves, something to feed their families. Not only that, but God also commanded that his people should protect widows and aliens into the land. In Exodus 22:22, we read, do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. You flip over to Deuteronomy 10, verse 18, God says, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the alien, giving him food and clothing. God cares about people like Naomi and Ruth. I don't want us to leave this point too quickly. There's nobody less worthy of care from an economic, social, or political standpoint than an aging widow and her foreign, also widowed daughter in law. They're nothing more than a burden to society. But God cares for the people that society wants to throw away. From a social standpoint, Naomi and Ruth, they don't deserve anything. But God saw all of Naomi's bitterness towards him, and he loved her anyway. He knew that Ruth was an alien, a foreigner, a Moabite, and she had a place in his heart. God's compassionate providence is all throughout this book. In verse 3, we discover that Ruth just happened to find herself in a field belonging to Boaz. What a coincidence, right? But we don't believe in coincidences. Here's a widowed foreigner who just so happens to come to work in this big field owned by somebody who loves God and has the ability to care for somebody in her situation. The author intends for us to see the irony of this. Ruth comes to the only field in all of Israel where she could find the help, protection, and provision she needed. This is the sweetness of God. God is working behind the scenes to bring about his purposes. There's nothing random or left to chance about life. There is only the providence of God. Faith doesn't believe in coincidences. It depends on providence. We know the story, and we understand that Ruth didn't just happen to show up in Boaz's fields. We understand that God is working in the background of the story, moving the parts and directing the path. The next thing that we discover is that a need is met out of kindness, mercy, and grace. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather your grain. Do not go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked. I am only a foreigner. Can we take a moment here just to admit that this is so much better than any Hallmark Christmas movie? Boy meets girl, girl needs some help, she's in need. Boy is kind and compassionate and godly, and without any ulterior motives whatsoever, the boy does everything he can to help someone in need. Not only did God providentially lead Ruth to a field, he also led her to someone who could show her kindness. Boaz is a wealthy landowner, many harvesters working in his field, plenty of the poor people in that area gleaning in those fields. And yet, out of all of that, he notices Ruth and he asks his foreman about her. Notice how the foreman identifies her. He doesn't even call her by name. He's simply the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. The story keeps emphasizing that Ruth is from Moab, that she is a Moabite. Don't miss the fact that she's a Moabite. Don't forget that she's a foreigner. Don't get it out of your mind that she's a Moabite, and the Moabites are the enemies of God and God's people. After all, it would be understandable if the Israelite Boaz looked at the Moabite Ruth with contempt. Nobody would have said much if Boaz threw her out of his fields or allowed harm to come to her. After all, she's nothing more than a Moabite. That's Ruth's identity in Israel up to this point. She's a foreigner, she's an outsider, she doesn't belong here. But Boaz understood that the land didn't belong to him, the land belonged to God. And God gets to decide who's worthy to come into the land and be provided for and who gets taken care of. Boaz is wired to show kindness. He doesn't sit back and wait. He takes the initiative to help. He gave her the right to stay close to the young women. He gave her permission to go after his servants who were reaping and getting the best of what's left over. And he charged his men, don't harm her. He gets all of these young men together and he says, guys, see that Moabite woman over there? Look, I know she's cute, but if you touch her, if you harm her in any way, shape, or form, I have this really big field. No one will ever find your body. You understand? Boaz is a protector, a provider, a defender. And when she's thirsty, he says, you go and you don't even have to draw your own water out of the well. You can drink water that's already drawn. He ensures her safety in a world that's not naturally safe, especially for people like her. Boaz used what he had for Ruth's protection, and Ruth is astounded. She knows her place as a foreigner, as a widow, as someone who's at the mercy of others. And yet, this wealthy man not only takes notice of her, he shows her kindness, and she has no way to pay him back. Everything in her life is a struggle for survival. She didn't leave Moab because she saw a better life for her in Bethlehem. Actually, it was going to be a harder life for someone like her, but she goes anyway. She could not possibly have had any great expectations. So when Boaz notices her and shows her kindness and invites her into his circle, she can't believe it. When Boaz, or when she asked Boaz, why are you showing me so much kindness? I love his response. He said, I know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done. When Boaz looks at Ruth, he doesn't see a poor foreigner scavenging in his fields. He sees this woman who makes a radical commitment of faith to the Lord, to taking care of Naomi, to moving to Israel. Of all of the places she could have gone, of all of the gods that the world had offered her to worship, she comes to Israel, to the God of Israel, and she finds refuge under his wings. It was not only her love for her mother-in-law that compelled her to come to Israel. Faith brought Ruth to Bethlehem. Faith caused Ruth to stay with Naomi. Faith drove Ruth to Boaz's fields. Boaz tells Ruth her character and her reputation is already well known in the community. He understands that she's had a rough life. He knows she left her family to come to Bethlehem to serve Yahweh. She's claimed God's people. She's been loyal and faithful to a mother-in-law. So he encourages her in her walk with the Lord by speaking words of blessing over her. The message of the Christmas story is that you and I, we have a lot in common with Ruth. We're sinners. We come from the wrong background. We come to the Lord empty-handed and needy. And Jesus pours out his mercy, grace, and kindness. In the same way that Boaz looked out over his field and saw Ruth, we discover that Jesus looks out over the world and sees us. In the same way that Boaz pursued Ruth, Jesus pursues us. In the same way that Boaz speaks kindly to Ruth, Jesus speaks kindly to us. In the same way that Boaz pours out kindness and grace, Jesus has gone far beyond the requirements of the law and given us an abundance of kindness and grace. But Boaz isn't content to just pour out grace. When he considered how much God had blessed him, he was compelled to pour out mercy as well. Going back to Ruth chapter 2, starting in verse 14, we read, "At mealtime, Boaz called to her, 'Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine.' So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, 'Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. And let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time.' Ruth, the widowed Moabite, who left her homeland with an empty stomach, now finds a fullness she could have never imagined. Boaz not only gave her permission to glean from her field and to protect her as she does, he also invites her to eat the bread, to dip it in the wine. How long has it been since Ruth tasted something so decadent, so wonderful? She sits beside the reapers among Boaz's people. She's not behind them, she's beside them. He elevates her status. He invites her inside his inner circle. He passes roasted grain to her, and she eats until she's satisfied, and there's enough to have some left over. She's given permission to get up, to go glean again, but this time with a full belly. And then to add mercy on top of grace, Boaz gave additional orders to the men. Usually the gleaners are only supposed to follow behind to pick up anything that's left on the ground. Boaz gives Ruth special permission to go and gather from the piles of grain the harvesters have already gathered and bundled together. Not only that, he says, pull some extra stalks out on purpose and leave them on the ground for her to find them. And once again, he declares his protection over her. This story is saturated with grace and overflowing with mercy. There's nothing that Ruth has done to deserve this treatment from Boaz. She couldn't earn this favor. She couldn't pay for this favor. Boaz treats Ruth with grace and compassion based on his character. Which leads us to the third thing that we understand about this story. God intends for us to use our blessings to bless others. Going back to the text, so Ruth gathered barley there all day. And when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother in law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother in law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him." Naomi told her daughter in law, "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you will be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in the early summer. And all the while, she lived with her mother in law. I mean, that's amazing. Boaz put God first in his life. He shows kindness to the poor. He encourages Ruth in her walk with the Lord. He protects her. He provides for her. And what's the result of all of this? Ruth worked so hard that she was able to bless her mother in law, Naomi. She worked hard all day. And when she threshed out all of the grain that she gathered, it says she had a whole basket of grain, which weighed about 30 pounds. That's almost enough food for a month. Most gleaners would have been happy to go home with 1 or 2 pounds of grain at the most. Ruth comes dragging this heavy basket home that's full. And not only that, remember the meal that he gave her for lunch? She put the leftovers in a doggy bag and she took it back to Naomi for supper. She was thinking about Naomi of sharing the kindness she received. It's Naomi's turn to be blessed with mercy. When Ruth told her that all of this came out of the field of Boaz, you could see Naomi's lights light up. The same eyes that had been darkened by the loss of her husband and her boys now begin to twinkle like Christmas tree lights with hope. Naomi knows that name. She understands this is not some strange fluke or coincidence. This is the providence of God. And there's more blessings to come. Blessings stacked on top of blessings on top of blessings. Ruth not only is allowed to work safely in the field of Boaz throughout the entire barley harvest, she's allowed to work in the fields during the wheat harvest as well. The barley was always harvested first. It lasted about 3 weeks. And then the wheat harvest happened, and it lasted 4 weeks beyond that. Ruth is blessed with 7 weeks of harvesting in fields that she didn't own, she didn't plant, she didn't work. And in those 7 weeks, she possibly could get enough food for an entire year, all because Boaz is willing to share the blessings of God with others. The book of Ruth is a story of a righteous man who offered kindness, protection, and provision to a young woman in time of need. That's the Christmas story. The Christmas story is a story of a righteous man who offers kindness, protection, and provision to those of us who are in deep need. What happened to Ruth that day is a picture of what happens to all of us when we come to Christ. He lifts us up. He cares, he provides, he pours out mercy and grace. He elevates us to a place at his table. He welcomes us to sit at the table, not behind the table, at the table. He elevates your status. He invites you into his inner circle, and he passes us the bread and the cup, symbols of his love for us. And so today, as you go to the table, it is my hope that you were able to think about all of the ways that God has poured out his kindness, his mercy, and his grace in your life. And then I want you to think about your responsibility to take that mercy, that grace, and that kindness and to share it with others so that the whole world will know that we serve a Savior who was born in a manger, lived a life of perfection, died on a cross for our inadequacies, our sin, our selfishness, and was resurrected on the third day so that we could have the hope that is given to us through this beautiful story of Christmas. Have a great week. I look forward to seeing you very soon.